All right, let's see whether talking about this stuff will clarify it in the course of time. So, the last video I did was pondering the question of how to think about morality and how to conceive of it. What is it? What do we mean when we speak about moral acts? And the conclusion that we drew so far was that moral action has something to do with the first person reality you are encountering and with the second person reality. So it has something to do with the subjectivity of beings that you encounter and with their intersubjective world as well. It's basically a response to subjective reality, just as we respond to objective or third person reality. So when a rock is moving towards you and you move to the side, you respond to third person reality. Or when you do science, when you try to figure out how third person reality functions, how it works, when you try to understand how your body is composed, in a very similar way, what we're doing when we're talking about moral actions, those are actions that have considered first person reality, so the subjectivity of the other being encountering us. And now the question might pop up, wait a minute, don't we need God for this? Don't we need God for this to make sense? Because if you look at traditional ways of thinking about morality, basically always make some kind of reference to God. For an action to be good, it has to have been legitimized by God's will. Otherwise, it doesn't really count as moral. This is at least a traditional way we're thinking about this. And what I'm suggesting is that first person reality is already enough to render the statement of something being moral or immoral already meaningful. You don't need something additional to first person reality for the term morality or moral action to actually have meaning, and enough meaning if you want. It's not necessarily lacking something. And this might be looking like a trick, right? It might be looking like, hey, wait a minute. All you're doing is you're basically saying the way you relate to third person reality, if you take that and apply that to first person reality as well. So if you pay attention to first person reality, the subjectivity of others, take that as a concern into consideration, then that already constitutes moral action. Well, what would the alternative be if you think about it for a moment? The alternative would be to say that the subjective will of a being that you're encountering, the subjective state of a being that you're encountering, a living organism or experiencing organism is the more important part here, doesn't really make a difference to the morality or immorality of an action. Now, this intuitively just doesn't sound right. If you need some additional referent which makes the moral action good or bad, good or evil, and the will of the individual that you're facing here, the individual that is making a moral call to you, that it's expecting you to respond, if that will doesn't make a difference, the alternative view is that we need a third thing that renders action moral or immoral, and that the will itself, the subjectivity itself, doesn't make a difference to the picture. And then if you ponder that for a moment, it doesn't seem right. It simply means that just by virtue of expressing an interest, someone else expressing an interest towards you, and addressing you with that interest, and expecting you to take that interest into account, they actually shouldn't and could never possibly have any leverage over you. In other words, they could never have any kind of power to make you take their interest into account, right? Unless you refer to a third being, a higher being, or whatever, they would legitimize and say, oh, it's okay to want. It is okay for you to wish. It is okay for you to wish to not to die. I grant that, and therefore it becomes a moral action to take that wish into account. But as a wish, as an interest, as a first person reality itself, first person reality would become basically inconsequential. It would be irrelevant. And we would have the alternative, again, we will be back in the picture, where it shouldn't then make a difference whether you destroy a world which is devoid of all sentience, and whether you destroy a world which is not devoid of sentience, but where you have sentient beings who have an experience of what it's like to be them, and who have this evaluative relationship towards those experiences, to whom it makes a difference whether they experience or not, to whom it makes a difference whether they are alive or dead, where there are interests. And this doesn't sound right. This would degrade interests of first-person reality to basically third-person reality. It, it would make them something that doesn't have an intrinsic value, right? It would make them to something that only derives its value, so the value of your subjective experiences is derived only from an external source and never from themselves. This is the alternative that you have to choose. Do we regard first-person reality as an end in itself, as Kant puts it, already, without the necessary need to refer to something else? Do we see them as already perfect in themselves? Or do we see first-person reality as something that is basically nothing else but means to an end, and derives its internal value from something else, from some other source? That's the alternative you have to choose. And you have to think about that, how you would stand raising this question. How would you respond to that question? And historically, I think in a large part of human history, the position that has been taken is that first-person reality doesn't have intrinsic value. It's nothing special. And first-person reality does need a reference to a higher being to render it valuable. In other words, God has to decide this is good. It's okay for you to wish to live. And the moment this external will comes into the picture, first-person reality suddenly becomes something holy, something that is worthy of protection. But before that, before this external force is introduced into the picture, first-person reality is no different from third-person reality, and not to be treated differently from third-person reality. And this is exactly how we have been treating animals. Think about it. And we're still treating animals like that. Animals have a first-person reality, and they have second-person reality. They have social reality as well. And yet, we have, for the most part of human history, have been treating them as if they were objects. The discourse around the interiority of animals is actually a pretty recent phenomenon. The discourse to realize that other beings are not just there, they're not just objects and things you can move around and use for your own ends and interests. This discourse is barely a few hundred years old. Even the idea that other human beings are not just objects and things you can just move around, but they have their own will, they have their own intentionality and interiority, and considering that is an entirely different process from treating them as objects. This discourse is barely 300 years old. It's insane. It's crazy how young this stuff is. It sounds weird because today it's so obvious that we make the distinction between first person and third person reality, between objects and subjects and subjectivity and objectivity. But this stuff, and even the terminology around that, is barely a few hundred years old. In the 18th century, the whole idea of subjectivity and subjecthood, so first-person reality, was introduced into the common sense and into the picture. And it resulted in entire philosophical schools that were basically based on the idea, hey, what about first-person reality? We've figured out that we can look at first-person reality, at subjectivity, and it's not something that's trivial. Descartes was one of the first to introduce the notion of subjectivity or interiority into the picture. And to him, subjectivity wasn't a big deal. He thought about subjectivity or consciousness to be something that's very trivial in a sense. It's given, right? Something's either conscious or is not. When it's conscious, then it's kind of self-transparent. Then you just wish something, and there is nothing to explain about your wish. There is no unconscious aspects of your wish. You just wish for something, or you think something. You have an idea. You have a judgment. That judgment manifests as something that you are aware of, and you can look at why you think the way you think about something. All you have to do is just look at your thought, take it apart, analyze it, and there is nothing that you could not see. Right? There is nothing that could possibly be hidden from you. So wishes, interests are already self-transparent, fully fledged out, fully given to you, and in a sense they're boring because there is nothing to learn there. I mean, your subjectivity is just your subjectivity. You experience something, you wish something, you have a certain desire, and they manifest as what they are in front of your inner eye. You see them, you witness them, you experience them, and there is nothing else to think about them, to discover about them. They're basically self-given and self-transparent. So subjectivity is kind of boring. So even to Descartes, who introduced the whole notion into the picture, subjectivity is a cool thing, but it's kind of boring. It's kind of trivial. It's self-explanatory, right? But he introduced it into the picture, and people started asking a question, wait a minute, does it make a difference when we think about reality in first-person terms, so when we look at the interiority of the reality surrounding us, or look at it from the third-person perspective, when we treat it as object and as physical reality. Yes, it makes a difference. And this brought forth entire philosophical schools that ask the question, how would our worldview change if we start from first-person reality? So German idealism, for example, starts from that vantage point. It starts from the question, what is consciousness? What is experience? And how does this change our perception of reality as a whole? How does it change the perception of beings that are foreign to us? So step by step, the idea that today is very common as well, the idea of the unconscious, was brought into the picture. Namely, which is that subjectivity is not something that's self-transparent. It's not something that you can't learn anything about. But quite the opposite. When you ponder subjectivity, when you rest in subjectivity and look at subjectivity in first-person reality, what in the course of time actually happens, you sharpen your perception of first-person reality. You start to see differences. You start to see distinctions that weren't there from the start. Subjectivity can become, as Vogel puts it, you can differentiate subjectivity. It can become richer, it can become refined. And this is one of the major ideas in German Romanticism, for example, that subjectivity is not just self-given, but in resting in subjectivity, you can refine your subjective sense, felt sense, and you can make it richer. You can, and this is something that is also expressed in music, and a basic idea behind music that when you hear a musical form, by resting in that form, it becomes more rich to you in the course of time. If you want, objective approach to this is that you can start to relate it to more and more other forms that you see and hear. The subjective experience of that, the first person experience of that, is that it becomes more interesting. And it becomes endless. For example, if you play Bach, it's always interesting. And there are endlessly many ways in which you can play it. And it will always remain this novelty in it because there's new ways of approaching it, right? And it always remains with this richness already built into it. But back to the topic, and the issue was, we basically, all we did so far is to say, well, look, morality has to do with responding to first-person reality. And it's basically taking in, responding, just as we respond to third-person reality, to respond to first-person reality. And this doesn't seem very satisfying because it seems to be missing something. It seems to be missing the picture of some higher source, right, which gives morality its actual moral value. And the decision that we have to make is, well, do you see first-person reality as having a special stand, as being something very, very unique and very special and different from third-person reality, and having its own intrinsic value already? Or do you think it needs something else, something external, to be introduced to the picture, to have something like internal value? These are basically the two positions that you can take. And for myself, I'm pretty clear that to me, animals having first-person reality, their will is something that's clearly different and has intrinsic value from them just existing as physical bodies. So the discourse that was led in the Middle Ages, and this was not a joke, but when I was talking about animals shrieking out in pain, as this being interpreted as basically the squeaking of a door hinge, this was actually real discourse that was had in the Middle Ages. People really considered the first-person reality of animals to be nothing else but a purely mechanistic process, behind which there is no experiencer, behind which there is nobody, right? So if you ask the question, is there somebody behind the eyes of an animal? Is there somebody behind the eyes of your dog? Behind the root of their nose? Is there somebody there looking into the world and experiencing the world, and to whom it makes a difference how you treat them? Many people in medieval discourse would actually respond, no, there is nobody there. They're not subjects, right? They would respond, they're not thinking, and if they can't think, they are not full-fledged subjects. So they're basically mechanisms. They're basically object-like, if you want. I think this picture has significantly changed. I think it's much more popular today to think about consciousness in terms of its first-person qualities. And when we focus on those, like the experience of what it's like to be in a conscious state, it becomes very obvious that you can push it very, very far down to much more simple organisms, and even assume that there is somebody there experiencing something, whatever it might be and how different it might be from our experience. And this already is a difference that makes a difference. This is something that makes a difference compared to a world in which there are no such beings. And responding to the world, to this kind of world, requires from you a different form of engagement than a world which is dead, than a world which is composed of nothing but mechanisms and even systems, if you want. But as long as there is no experiencing beings, as long as there's nobody there, the kind of response that this world requires from you, the kind of cognitive engagement that it requires from you, is very different from a world in which there are experiencing beings. And if we look at intellectual history from the 18th century on, the major question that has been raised again and again, and the major driving force behind it, has always been, how does this discovery of interiority, as I think Charles Taylor puts it, how does this change the way we cognate? How does this change the way we think about reality? Because it seems to require a different way of approaching reality from you, the moment you realize that there are other experiencing beings in that world. So we started out with the idea that, well, this is just too trivial. It can't be as simple as that. It can't be moral action just having to do with first-person reality. But if you look at the history of thinking about and around moral reality, we figure out, hey, the distinction first person, third person is not that old. It's actually pretty young. And it's something that has had extreme consequences across all academic disciplines the moment it was discovered and introduced into the picture through Cartesian thinking. And it has brought forth, for example, sciences like education, which specifically deal with the question of looking at the interiority of something that's foreign, a child. Children don't have the same interiority as adults do. This is stuff that we've learned just a few hundred years ago. It's not, even barely more than 100 years ago, this stuff was not common knowledge. People treated children as if they were adults. They basically thought of children as having the same interiority as adults, just knowing less than adults. The concept that you can have interiority that is structurally different from your interiority, that is not only, that doesn't only have different content, so children can't name as many things as you do, but that experience is differently shaped and structured in children than they are in adults, and they have different consequences for children as well. So the same situation, the same challenge, the same painful experience to a child will have, and it's something this is something that we know for sure, will have different consequences on the mind of a child than it will have on the mind of an adult. There are significant differences between adults and children, going far beyond just cognitively adults knowing more about reality than children do. I mean, what we learned with Piaget, I think, pretty well, is that the way we think and the way we structure reality and the way we experience reality shifts significantly between children and adults. And this stuff, I mean, if you look at it, this kind of research is barely 100 years old. So it's not trivial. The first person, third person distinction is not a trivial thing. And the idea that there is unconscious within you, so just having a wish doesn't already make itself transparent and doesn't really justify it already, but you can have unconscious aspects for why you have that wish in the first place. This is also something that's pretty young. I wouldn't say it's coming with Freud. I think it was there as an idea much earlier than Freud, but still it is something that could be placed within the past 200 or 300 years of intellectual history, right? So this stuff is not trivial. The distinction and recognition, the discovery of interiority as its own reality, and this reality demanding something from you, just as the physical reality demands something from you, is not trivial, and I think already brings something to the table that renders the statements about morality meaningful to a certain degree. Not fully yet. I don't think we have covered the entire thing, because it gets really very confusing at the end of the day, because we mean like 20 different things when we say that something is moral or immoral. But I think it helps fleshing out, and it certainly is a relevant point. It certainly is a relevant point that first-person reality plays a role in how we define what is moral and what is not. And first-person reality has intrinsic value, right? And what this could mean, something having intrinsic value, right, that it doesn't need to refer to something else to derive its value from. What value could actually mean in this context? I'll try to figure that out in one of the next recordings.